During a family dinner, I announced I was marrying someone outside our culture. My grandfather slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "You're destroying our bloodline." My parents agreed, calling me a disgrace. I held back tears and whispered, "You don't know what I went through to make this decision." When they met my fiancé's family and learned our story, their hearts softened. This happened last year, and even now, I still think about it. It changed everything. I was born into a very traditional family. You know the type. Family name matters, reputation is everything, and who you marry is a reflection of your loyalty. I grew up knowing my path was already planned out. My parents expected me to marry someone from our culture, someone they approved of. It wasn't just about love. It was about keeping the bloodline pure, maintaining traditions, and honoring our ancestors. For a long time, I thought I'd go along with it. I dated people they approved of, played the role of the good child, and never questioned anything. But life doesn't always follow a script. Then I met her. She wasn't from our culture. She didn't speak our language. She didn't follow our customs. And yet, she understood me better than anyone ever had. At first, I didn't let myself fall. I told myself it wouldn't work. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized I'd never truly been myself before her. With her, I wasn't just a son, a grandson, a person fulfilling family obligations. I was just me. I knew what this meant. I knew my family wouldn't accept it. But I also knew I couldn't walk away from her. So, I prepared myself for the storm. I chose a family dinner to break the news. I thought if I told them all at once, it would be easier. I was wrong. We were gathered at my grandfather's house, a big traditional meal spread across the table. My parents were there, my aunts, uncles, cousins, basically everyone who had ever had an opinion on how I should live my life. Halfway through the meal, I took a deep breath and said it. "I want you all to know that I'm engaged." Smiles. Congratulatory murmurs. My mother touched her chest, already imagining a wedding filled with our traditions. Then I said, "Her name is fiancé's name, and she's not from our culture." Silence. Then my grandfather slammed his fist on the table so hard the dishes rattled. "You're destroying our bloodline," he roared. My father shook his head in disappointment. My mother looked like she was about to cry. "You're a disgrace," my uncle muttered under his breath. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to us?" my mother asked, her voice shaking. "Do you even care?" My cousin, who I'd always considered close, looked away, suddenly fascinated by his plate. I swallowed hard. I expected anger. I expected disappointment. But hearing those words from my own family still stung. "You don't know what I went through to make this decision," I whispered. And I meant it. They didn't know how many nights I'd spent agonizing over this. They didn't know how I had tried, really tried, to find someone within our culture just to make them happy. They didn't know how much pressure I had felt my entire life to be something I wasn't. They didn't know that the moment I met my fiancé, it felt like I could finally breathe. They didn't know that I had spent months rehearsing this conversation, preparing for their anger, their guilt trips, their threats. But the worst part? They didn't want to know. The dinner ended in disaster. My grandfather left the table. My mother cried. My father said he needed time to process it. Some of my relatives refused to look at me. I left that night feeling like I had lost my family. They stopped speaking to me. Calls went unanswered. My messages were ignored. It was like I had never existed to them. I knew this would happen, but knowing doesn't make it hurt any less. I started questioning everything. Had I made a mistake? Had I chosen love at the cost of losing the people who raised me? But every time I looked at my fiancé, I knew I had made the right choice. Then, out of nowhere, my mother reached out. "Come to dinner next Sunday," she said. "And bring her." I stared at the message for a long time. I had no idea what had changed, but I was about to find out. I didn't sleep much after my mother sent that message. For weeks, my family had treated me like I was dead. Now, suddenly, they wanted to meet my fiancé? It didn't feel right. Something was off. I showed my fiancé the message. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked. I wasn't, but a part of me needed to know if there was even a small chance they'd come around. So I replied, "We'll be there." That Sunday, we arrived at my parents' house. I could already feel the tension before we even stepped inside. My mother greeted us at the door. She smiled, but it wasn't real. It was the kind of smile you put on when you're forcing yourself to be polite. My father barely looked at us. My grandfather wasn't even there. The table was set, but no one was eating. The air was thick. My fiancé squeezed my hand under the table, and I was grateful for it. "So," my mother said, forcing another smile, "tell us about yourself." My fiancé tried. She talked about her job, her family, her childhood. She was warm, kind, and everything I loved about her. No one responded. They just watched her, like they were waiting for her to slip up. Then my uncle spoke. "How do you plan to raise your children?" There it was. The real reason they invited us. "What do you mean?" my fiancé asked. "In our culture, children take after the father's side," he said. "Will they follow our traditions, or yours?" I could feel my fiancé tense next to me. "We haven't talked about children yet," she said honestly. Wrong answer. My mother inhaled sharply, like my fiancé had just cursed at her. "So you don't respect our traditions," my father muttered. "We never said that," I shot back. My mother sighed dramatically. We just don't want our future grandchildren to grow up confused about who they are. Future grandchildren. I almost laughed. They had spent weeks pretending I didn't exist, but now they suddenly cared about children who weren't even born yet? We aren't here to debate, I said, keeping my voice steady. You invited us to dinner. We came. But if you only did this to interrogate her, we'll leave. My father put his fork down. That's not what this is, he said. We just want to understand what kind of life you're choosing. Choosing. Like I had woken up one day and decided to fall in love with someone from a different background just to spite them. My fiancé gave me a look. I knew what she was thinking. This is pointless. Then my cousin, the same one who had avoided looking at me during the last dinner, spoke up. I think we should let them be happy, he said. The whole room went silent. My uncle gave him a sharp look, but my cousin didn't back down. Look, he said, I get it. But if he was marrying someone from our culture and she was a terrible person, would you still be okay with it just because she fits? My father's jaw clenched. My mother looked away. I felt something shift in that moment. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was the first crack in the wall. After dinner, my mother asked me to stay back. I almost said no, but something in her eyes made me pause. My fiancé waited outside while my mother sat me down in the kitchen. There's something you need to know, she said. She reached into a drawer and pulled out an old photo. It was a picture of my grandfather with a woman I didn't recognize. This was his first love, she said. I stared at the photo, confused. She wasn't from our culture either, she continued. They wanted to be together, but his parents refused. They forced him to marry your grandmother instead. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. He never got over it, she said quietly. That's why he's so angry. It's not just about you. It's about what he lost. I couldn't speak. My grandfather, the man who had slammed his fist on the table and called me a disgrace, had been in my exact position once. And he had given in. I didn't know what to do with that information. But I knew one thing. This wasn't just my fight anymore. I sat there, staring at the photo. My grandfather looked so different. Young, smiling, holding the woman like she was the only thing that mattered. My mother watched me carefully, like she was waiting for me to explode. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. She sighed. Because I see the way you look at her. It's the same way he looked at. She hesitated, then said the name softly, like it was some kind of curse. Isabel. I had never heard that name before. She was the love of his life, my mother continued. But his parents told him if he married her, he'd be disowned. He chose family. He always said it was his duty. But after that, he was never the same. I thought back to the way my grandfather had slammed his fist on the table. The way he had looked at me with pure rage, like I was betraying generations of tradition. But now, I saw it differently. Maybe it wasn't just anger. Maybe it was guilt. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was about to go to bed when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. Come to the house tomorrow. Your grandfather wants to talk. I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to go, but something told me I needed to. When I arrived, the house was quiet. My grandfather was sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. For the first time in my life, he looked old. I sat down across from him. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, without looking at me, he spoke. You think you're strong because you're fighting for her. His voice was rough, like he had spent the whole night drinking. But love isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to walk away. I clenched my fists. You walked away, and you've spent your whole life regretting it. His jaw tightened. Regret is easier than being alone. I shook my head. No, it's not. He finally looked at me. His eyes weren't angry anymore. Just tired. Then he said something I never expected. She's still alive. I froze. What? Isabel. His voice was barely above a whisper. She's still alive. I looked her up once. She never married. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. I didn't know why he was telling me this. Maybe he thought it would scare me. Show me what happens when you let love get in the way of tradition. But it had the opposite effect. It only made me more sure. I wasn't going to let my story end the way his had. Later that night, I told my fiancée everything. She listened quietly, then squeezed my hand. What if we find her? She asked. I stared at her. Your grandfather still talks like he lost her forever. But he hasn't. What if we give him a chance to fix things? It was insane, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I did something I never thought I'd do. I searched for Isabel. And I found her. Finding Isabel wasn't difficult. She was still living in the same city, in a small house near the waterfront. I don't know what I expected. Maybe that she had moved on. Maybe that she had forgotten. But when I knocked on her door and she opened it, I knew immediately. She hadn't forgotten. Her eyes, deep and full of something between sadness and recognition, scanned my face. And then she whispered, "You look just like him." That's when I knew she still loved my grandfather. I told her everything. About my grandfather. About my fiancé. About how history was repeating itself. She listened quietly. When I finished, she sighed. Your grandfather didn't just walk away from me, she said. He was forced to. I frowned. What do you mean? She looked down at her hands, as if debating whether to continue. Then she said something that made my blood turn to ice. Your great-grandfather threatened to ruin my family. I blinked. What? My parents owned a small business. It was all we had, she said, voice steady but laced with old pain. One day, Your great-grandfather came to see my father. He told him if I didn't break it off with his son, he would destroy us. I felt my hands shaking. He wasn't lying, she continued. He had connections. He could have done it. So I told your grandfather I didn't love him. I made him hate me. It was the only way. I couldn't breathe. All my life, I thought my grandfather had chosen to leave her. That he had been weak, that he had given up. But he never even had a choice. And now, here I was, fighting the same battle. I knew what I had to do. That Sunday, I called a family meeting. Everyone showed up. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins. Even my grandfather, though he sat in the corner, silent and brooding. I didn't waste time. I pulled out the old photograph. Then, I told them everything. About Isabel. About how their so-called honor was built on a lie. About how they had stolen his happiness and now they were trying to steal mine. The room erupted. My uncle scoffed. That was a long time ago. So that makes it okay? I shot back. My mother looked furious. Why are you bringing this up now? You think digging up the past is going to fix anything? It's not about fixing the past, I said, voice rising. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. Then I turned to my grandfather. She never stopped loving you, I said. You didn't lose her. She was taken from you. His face crumpled. For the first time, he looked broken. The room fell into dead silence. Then, in a voice so quiet I barely heard it, he whispered, I knew. The words hit me like a brick. You knew? I echoed. He nodded. Not then. Not at first. But later, I found out. And by then, it was too late. I was shaking. And you still let them do this to me? He looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw tears in his eyes. I was a coward, he admitted. I convinced myself I had no choice. But you have a choice. I swallowed hard. Then stand with me. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then he nodded. I will. My parents were furious. My mother accused me of disrespecting the family. My father called me selfish. My uncle said I was bringing shame on all of them. But for the first time, I didn't care. Because my grandfather, the man who once called me a disgrace, stood beside me. And then he said something that silenced the room. I failed my own son. I won't fail my grandson. I saw it then, the shame in my father's eyes. He wouldn't admit it, not now. Maybe not ever. But for a split second, I knew. He had wanted to fight for love, too. And just like my grandfather, he hadn't. The cycle ended with me. It wasn't easy after that. Some of my family refused to speak to me. Others tried to guilt me into breaking things off. My parents were cold, distant. But my grandfather changed. He went to see Isabel. I don't know what they said to each other, but when he came back, he looked lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. And at my wedding, when I stood at the altar and saw my fiancé walking toward me, I saw him in the front row. For the first time, he was smiling. A real smile. I lost a lot, but I gained more. I broke a cycle that had lasted for generations. I fought for love when everyone told me not to. And I learned that sometimes, the people who fight you the hardest are the ones who lost their own battles a long time ago. My grandfather never got his second chance. But I did, and I wasn't going to waste it.